Hello guys, I am Agathor and welcome to a guide to damage in DayZ Standalone. This video will contain a collective knowledge of what we know so far about damage, but I won't be including a damage formula so you can calculate damage yourself because most people would find that useless and the numbers will likely change. Instead, we're going to be looking at the different variables used to calculate damage by DayZ's engine and go into detail of how predominant each of those variables is. As a disclaimer, I don't get insider information from the developers about how DayZ works. Based on information that everybody has access to, me and others test theories to get logical answers about DayZ's many mechanics, so by no means is this info conclusive or confirmed. That said, there are 6 variables used to calculate damage in DayZ Standalone. Stats of the damage inflicting item used, speed of the damage inflicting item when it hits the target, body part hit by the damage inflicting item, stats of the clothing on that body part, number of affected pieces of clothing and items within that clothing, and quality level of the clothing and items affected. I use the term damage inflicting item because the DayZ engine considers all forms of damage caused by players or zombies to be one type of damage. This is why the sound for hitting a wall with a bullet or a melee weapon makes the same noise. Each damage inflicting item in DayZ has a stat for blood, health, shock and bleed chance, meaning the engine does not differentiate between someone punching someone else with fists or using a Mosin to put a hole in someone. The engine only looks at the stats on the damage inflicting item to determine the damage inflicted. Melee weapons have additional stats like range and swing speed, and each melee weapon has logical characteristics. For example, a screwdriver has a very high chance to make you bleed, but does a low amount of shock damage even to the head, whereas a baseball bat has a low chance to make you bleed, but causes a very high amount of shock damage. Projectiles like the 7.62 rounds or 357 rounds also have 2 additional stats which determine the velocity of a bullet, and brings us to the second variable used in calculating damage. These 2 stats affect how fast a projectile leaves a weapon and how quickly the projectile slows down while travelling through the air. The slower the projectile becomes, the lower the amount of damage is inflicted when it hits the target. Be aware that penetrating surfaces or causing a bullet to ricochet will also slow down a bullet, reducing its damage, and all of the stats I've mentioned so far for projectiles are not affected by the weapon it's fired from, so the blades and longhorn inflict the same amount of damage because they use the .308 rounds. The body part hit by the damage inflicting item is the most predominant variable of the 6, mainly because each damage inflicting item has an additional stat assigned to hitting the head of a player, causing a large amount of extra shock damage, sometimes reaching insane numbers. This isn't the case on the other 7 body parts found on a player, but each body part reduces blood, shock and health damage by a certain amount, as shown here from our tests. When hitting someone in the head, chest or pelvis, a 4th stat is considered by the engine, spinal damage. This type of damage is the deadliest if you don't know how to protect yourself against it. Clothing drastically improves our chances of survival when taking damage, but as we discovered recently, only the ballistic stat on clothing makes a difference among similar types of clothing, so a pristine Gorka jacket will protect you the same amount as a pristine Fresh Spawn t-shirt, because they both have no ballistic stat. The only items that have the ballistic stat are as follows: the rider's jacket with 0.2, the press vest and plate carrier with 2, the anti-stab vest with 0.1, and most helmets, with the ballistic helmet having the highest ballistic stat of 1.5. For each 1 point of ballistic stat, damage is reduced by roughly 5% on the body part that piece of clothing protects. The 8 types of clothing in DayZ protect our entire body, but some clothing types protect multiple body parts, such as pants protecting both our upper leg and lower leg. You can also stack clothing on the head and the torso, which reduces damage a fair amount and reduces the chances of bleeding when you take damage. Which brings us to the next variable, number of affected pieces of clothing and items within that clothing. Basically, having 3 pieces of chest protection and filling those 3 pieces with items will reduce how much damage you take to the torso, but the engine only considers clothing and items that are affected by the damage when calculating how much protection you have. As an example, the 22 round, because it inflicts a low amount of damage, will only affect a few items, whereas a 9mm round affects more items because it inflicts more damage. The effect damage has on items is reducing the quality level of the items affected until it becomes ruined. When a piece of clothing or item becomes ruined, it does not protect you at all from damage, so swapping out ruined gear and items is a must if you want to reduce how much damage you take. The final variable considered by the engine in determining damage is the quality level of clothing or items affected by damage. The higher the quality level, the more damage that clothing or item will absorb. From several tests, items inside clothing that become ruined through damage become ruined at the same rate as any other item in the game. So a cooking pot will become ruined at the same rate as a rag, for example. Because of this, it's better to put single slot items in your inventory over multiple slot items. It's also slightly better to put containers inside your inventory and fill these containers with single slot items because the container itself acts as an additional item to absorb more damage with. In conclusion, damage in DayZ is pretty damn complicated. I've managed to narrow down damage into 6 variables and into 2 categories: damage inflicting items and damage preventing items. The top 10 damage inflicting items are as follows. As for the best damage preventing items, stacking any pristine clothing with a ballistic stat filled with as many pristine items as possible will protect you the most. Thank you for watching, and thanks to everybody that helped obtain this information over the last few months.